Our next paper today hails from South Africa. It's titled The Evolving Social Security in South Africa, an Actuarial Perspective. It's the work of the Social Security Working Group of the Actuarial Society of South Africa. And we have Andrea here with us in person, and she's joined by her esteemed co-authors virtually who'll be presenting later on. We have Professor Megan Carswell, Stephen Walker and Natalie Van Zyl. And it's about 1:30 in the morning in South Africa, so let's thank you so very much to them for staying up and speaking to us. Megan is an adjunct professor at Wits University. Stephen's a consulting actuary employed by Old Mutual, and Natalie is an academic at Stellenbosch University, and Andrea is a product development actuary and pension fund valuator at Alex Forbes. So among them, they have several impressive years of experience in the social sector. So please, let's welcome Andrea first.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for affording us your time this morning to listen to our presentation. I know we all had a great time last night, and what a wonderful party, but I'm glad to see some faces in the audience. And I'm also thankful for my colleagues online. As mentioned, it is about 1:30 in the morning there, so a great resolve from them as well to be here and support me in this presentation. We will be talking to you about the social security sector in South Africa, just outlining how the benefits work, some proposals that are currently on the table and problems and thoughts on that, as well as then from our perspective, how we see actuaries contributing to these discussions in South Africa and our role in the actuarial profession on that. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Megan, who will set out the landscape and give you an indication of the social security in South Africa. So Megan, online, if you're online, I can see Natalie on screen. I hope Megan is there as well, but over to you.
In South Africa, the developed and developing world live side by side, often quite literally. Even before COVID-19, we had a very, very unequal society with a Gini coefficient of about 65. If we were to shrink our country of about 60 million people down to just 10 households, the picture would look something like what you see on screen. 2 in 10 households would have per capita income below the food poverty line. Now, the food poverty line is the amount of money that you need to feed one adult a minimally adequate diet for a month. A further 2 households would be above the food poverty line, but below the upper bound poverty line, which makes allowance for expenditure other than food. Now, this really uneven income distribution has implications for tax revenue collection. Only 2 of our 10 households would be above the threshold for personal income tax, or PIT. This is about 96,000 Rand per annum, which is the equivalent of 3 of the latest iPhone 14s. These same 2 households are responsible for 70% of the value-added tax revenues. A major contributor to this poverty and inequality is the number of working-age South Africans who are not working. So if we were to shrink our working-age population down to just 10 people, 3 of them would not be economically active, and a lot of these are women. 4 in the 10 would be working, but 1 of these would be in the informal sector or self-employed, which means they don't necessarily have access to some of the social insurance benefits or supplemental occupational benefits. Because as dire as this picture looks, South Africa does have an established social security system where the state or government and the private sector work together to help South Africans to save and try and keep households out of poverty. If we were to analyze our social security system, we could be using something like the International Labour Organization or ILO model, and the basis for that would be Tier 1 or social assistance, or as we call them in this country, grants. So as you can see from what's up on the screen, a large number of South African households are in receipt of these grants. And in fact, our 3 poorest households, or 30% of our poorest households, get more than half of their income from these grants. As income increases, the reliance on grants tends to decrease, except for a little blip that you see around the middle, which is caused by the relative size of some of the grants. Okay, speaking of which, Up on the screen, you can see our narrowest definition of poverty, the FPL. This is equivalent to about the cost of an iPhone charger, just the cable, and our broadest definition of poverty, the upper bound poverty line. Our most common grant in terms of take-up is the child support grant, which actually falls below the food poverty line measure. There are bigger grants available, such as those available on old age, for war veterans, disability, and for care of disabled children. The problem is that when households receive these grants, they're often spread among multiple uses and users, with the result that on a per capita basis, the income doesn't spread very far. And as a result, childhood stunting remains pervasive at about 25%. In April 2020, President Ramaphosa announced the introduction of a 350 Rand a month COVID-19 social relief of distress grants. Unemployed adults who are not in receipt of other grants were eligible to receive it. One of the driving forces behind this grant is that able-bodied South Africans of working age were otherwise unable to claim long-term social security. There was no other grant available for it, and our Tier 2 or social insurance gives cover for very, very specific events, as you can see on the screen. And often the benefit structures are very different between them, resulting in patchy and inconsistent coverage. Supplemental arrangements offered by employers are relatively common. About 60% of formal sector workers have access to them, but that's a very small percentage of the overall population. And discretionary benefits on Tier 4 were never meant to be a social safety net.
So at this point, we're going to hand over to Natalie to just take us through one of the proposals currently on the table, is the basic income grant in South Africa. So Natalie, over to you.
The South African government has a constitutional mandate to expand social security to everyone who needs it within the limits of affordability. Business, labour and the community groups all acknowledge the importance of social upliftment. But there are questions around the implementation of the basic income grant. Should BIG be a targeted grant or a universal one? What is the desirable level of the grant? And how can BIG be sensibly integrated with the other grant types and other benefits on different tiers? Many saw the COVID-19 grant as a type of targeted basic income grant. Payments were initially only promised for 3 months. This temporary grant has since been extended repeatedly, and an attempt to stop it was met with a civil backlash. There are 7 to 10 million people collecting their 350 Rand a month who would struggle to live without it. However, there are many other groups to consider. NEDLAC is a single forum for various stakeholders of business, community, government, and labour to reach consensus on any legislative proposals. Cost normally forms a significant part in discussions on a basic income grant. The cost of different levels of BIG directed at different segments of society has been estimated. Although BIG hasn't been institutionalized, the payment of a targeted benefit of 350 Rand a month is expected to continue and was included in the 2023-2024 tax year budget. This brought the total allocation to social development and grants to around 17% of South Africa's total revenue of 2.1 trillion Rand a year. Noticeably, 4.7% of our revenue is spent on old age grants. Is there a different way to achieve some of the objectives in the current grant system? If South Africa saved more, and these savings could be invested, the economy should grow, providing more jobs and enabling more people to save. This would reduce reliance on government grants. Over time, some of the pressure felt by working South Africans to support extended family members through remittances could be relieved.
Yeah, so basically the introduction of a compulsory national retirement savings scheme on Tier 2 would help with social upliftment and savings. Now, this arrangement, termed the National Social Security Fund, or the NSSF, has been bandied about for decades. And although stakeholders broadly agree that something like this is necessary, we have very little consensus on the detail. We don't have agreement on whether the fund should be a DB fund or a DC fund and what level of benefit is actually affordable. ILO modelling have indicated that the cost is simply more than what the people of South Africa can afford. And with our ageing population, in a DB scheme, the contribution rate is thought to be going to increase from 10% to 25% over time. The financing is undecided, and business is very wary of partially funded designs. Should both formal and informal workers participate in the fund? And if so, would opt-outs be allowed, and at what levels? What incentives could be given to people to participate, specifically lower income earners who would benefit very little from tax incentives? How would we allow for atypical and seasonal workers who have varying levels of income and fluctuating contribution patterns? Because in South Africa as well, our contributions are predominantly collected through the employer, not necessarily a state or a single agency. And then how would something like this be rolled out? Is it immediately? Do we phase it in over time? And how do we integrate it with the many existing structures in the country? And so to date, the introduction of Tier 2 savings arrangements has been very controversial and complex. And with all the current, albeit incohesive, benefit structures that is available in the country, one has to ask the question whether reforms would be better achieved by starting afresh and introducing a brand new scheme, or if we should rather build on and expand what we currently have in place. So as you can see on screen, my very meager attempt at Lego blocks, but just to give you an introduction of what we have, key grants can be universalized. Informal savings vehicles, they are called stokvels in South Africa. They exist and they're used very widely by the informal sector in South Africa. Insurance schemes, and particularly funeral schemes, are extensively used in the country, given the cultural importance of burials to the people of South Africa. Tax-free savings accounts and zero-fee bank accounts are also available. And then very importantly, South Africa has a very well-established Tier 3 retirement sector. Now, almost 60% of South Africans that are formally employed have some form of a retirement fund. And these funds are mainly occupational funds, but they are huge in the country. So currently, based on some of the figures and historic figures 2017, these funds had assets under management of about 4.3 trillion rand. So just to put that into context, that's about the equivalent size of our GDP. So they are huge. But despite this, the outcomes in the South African retirement sector has not been great. And over the last decade, we have been systematically implementing some of these forms, and some of them with quite a bit of success, and we're starting to see the fruits of that come through. Now, one of the biggest problems that we still need to address is leakage. So currently in South Africa, because your fund is linked to your employer, there is nothing in place that forces people to preserve these savings. So when you change jobs, you can cash in your savings, and that is one of the big problems that we see. But there is currently legislation on the table, and we expectedly, so the word on the street is that the draft legislation will be out this week, and we're all very anxious to see it, because the planned implementation date for this reform to forced preservation is still thought to be 1 March 2024. So I see in our audience, we do have Dr. David Knox here, so please, in your 2025 Mercer Index, we're all very keen to see what the impact of that was, but we're very positive about this reform because we think it will start making a difference. Now, introducing and adapting Tier 1 to 4 savings is challenging in the country, and there are many issues. So some of the issues include that we have uncoordinated policy making and lack of benefit alignment. So whilst NEDLAC was still considering the proposals for the NSSF put on the table by our interdepartmental task team, our Department of Social Development issued a different green paper to clarify the design of NSSF. Now, obviously, this was criticized for not considering the NEDLAC processes, and then it was subsequently withdrawn. So poor government and poor governance and misadministration and opaque benefit structures and excessive cost, both from private sector and public sector initiatives, have led to distrust among stakeholders. So we simply don't trust each other. And our government is struggling to address all the current issues and many issues that we have in the country as it stands, and we're struggling to juggle our expenditure relative to the current revenue. So there are fears that South Africa is facing a fiscal cliff, exacerbated, of course, by the COVID-19 pandemic and high levels of our government debt. So this cost of servicing the debt, as can be seen by this graph on screen, will increase over time. And so the increasing cost of the debt, the unexpected war, and of course the rolling ongoing blackouts in the country caused by our crumbling energy infrastructure is causing the economy to shrink. And in the last quarter of 2020, our GDP did contract. So South Africans are quite a resilient bunch, and we have started to adapt to many of the issues that we face, and many businesses have adapted to load shedding, which is our term for these rolling blackouts, and they've effectively learned to operate their business and count their money in the dark. But the sad reality is that businesses are struggling to grow, jobs are very scarce in the country, and many of our youth are unemployed. So the state of the economy and the level of the unemployment is intertwined. And so we have to ask ourselves where to from here and how do we find our way forward. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Stephen just to talk to us about how we see the way forward through all of this and how do we as actuaries contribute to these social issues. Stephen.
So within South Africa, there are many divergent views and there's much debate about a way forward in respect of social security reform, both on the introduction of a basic income grant and also on the launch of a national social security fund. So even when we speak to government departments or when government departments release their own views, they differ with one another sometimes quite drastically. In terms of the basic income grant, as far as we know, there is no other developing country which has already introduced such a universal basic income grant, so we would be the first as South Africa, whereas in terms of national social security funds, more than 80% of countries in sub-Saharan Africa have had national social security funds for decades already and have gone through different iterations of reforms in their own countries. So we're almost behind the curve on that side. So it's something that we still have to learn from also. Now, our society as a whole, what we're wrestling with is that we do have a limit when it comes to tax revenue and how this should be spent. So there's a need for the society to go through this process of discussion and debate to agree what should our priorities be as a country. And we've listed a number of different factors here that need to be considered. And actuaries, we think that we have a lot to add when it comes to being able to ensure the successful consideration and implementation when it comes to these factors. So we believe that our experience would be able to put us into the right position to assist the stakeholders, decision makers when it comes to implementation. So although we believe that we have much to add as a profession, what we struggle with is that we often don't have this impression that we're viewed as trusted advisors. So within government, labor, and the community, these different groupings that one sees at NEDLAC, actually are often viewed as being part of the problem, not being part of the solution. We're seen as representing this blood-sucking private sector that just seeks to make profit at the expense of the working class and the poor. So we're seen as defending vested interests when we speak about, oh no, but we can give advice. So what we're telling ourselves as a profession is that we need to learn to be more humble and more respectful and more prepared to listen to others. We need to stop trying to be seen as the smartest guy in the room, but rather actually listen as even more than the amount we're speaking, so that we can take into account the views and the experiences of others. Otherwise, we just come across as pushing for our own preconceived ideas as being the only solution, the best solution, the only solution. So instead of seeing ourselves as the referee, we feel that we should be trying to strive to be seen as team players who are fighting for a good result for the entire team. And often the problem we have is that what we think is the big picture, we're just looking at a subset of the population that normally uses financial services, whereas we often just automatically ignore the greater population in the country that's struggling just to survive. So this is the challenge for us as the profession that we've been working on for a number of years, to be seen in this way and to be heard. So we're striving towards this, we're continuously working towards this, and others from the actuarial profession internationally have got some tips for us. We greatly appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So that would bring us into our Q&A, but just to be clear, I don't think we think that actuaries are bloodsuckers. It's just a perception out there. But what Stephen says is exactly true, and I think part of the work that we've done part of the work that we've done in this working group is exactly that, to start contributing to the discussions, to give ourselves a seat at the table. So that in South Africa, we're in that fortunate position that we don't yet have national social security in place, etc., etc. So whilst the considerations are still being on the table and still being discussed, we want to be asked to partake in those conversations, and that for us is critical. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Challenges of social security are pretty hard all around the world, aren't they? But with a divided demography like you've got, must be so much. That adds another layer. Do we have any questions in the room to throw to? Well, all right, Peter, over to you.
On page 6, you said that 3 out of 10 people are economically inactive. What do you actually mean by that? Are they like women staying at home, or what type of people are you talking about?
Yeah, so that would... Yeah, Megan I would just wanted to say, so I would hand over to Megan at this point because that's the subject that she's quite passionate about. So if you heard the question, Megan, and you're online, over to you.
I am online. So economically inactive means that people are not interested in joining the economy. So it could be women at home. It could be people who are studying, for example. That's a very small percentage of the economically inactive population, or people who, for whatever reason, don't want to join the labour force. But it's 3 out of 10 is pretty high as an economically inactive proportion. Okay. And then obviously we've got the discouraged workers, and then our narrow definition of unemployment as well. We have the highest unemployment rate in the world.
Does raise the question again, how can you, if you have so many people who are economically active and you don't get any money, how can you be economically inactive and not have any money, as it were?
Yeah, so that, I think that is where the purpose or the discussions regarding the basic income grant comes in, because it's seen as a way to start getting people back into the economy and start building the economy so that businesses can grow, so that you can create those jobs, so that people can start getting into that active economy. But it is a big challenge. It's very difficult.
If I could just jump in there as well, I mean, what we've seen from studies in India is the basic income grant is often what's necessary to get poorer communities to work, because, particularly because of apartheid spatial planning, transport costs can be very significant. So people actually need to have some income in order to A, be able to get to work, or B, have some sort of skills training.
Thank you. Roseanne.
If I might add, even...
Go ahead, Natalie.
Thanks. Sorry. In South Africa, I've completely lost my train of thought now. Doing and throwing.
Maybe I'll ask my question in the meantime.
Go for it, Roseanne, and then we'll come back to you, if that's all right.
Roseanne Harris here from South Africa. So well done, team. Great presentation. I'm just thinking, as you're talking about being curious, in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, are there other examples that we can look at in terms of better fiscal coordination around the social security reforms? Because one of the challenges we have in South Africa is that we're reforming all over the place, right? We've got pension reform, we've got grant reform, we've got health reform, and we're not being coordinating that well. So are there other examples on our continent that we could look to?
Thank you. So I think in this one, I'm definitely going to hand over to Stephen, who I know has also been very active in what's going on in the rest of Africa, and potentially Megan as well for their research, and then I can share my thoughts after.
Okay, so good morning to Roseanne. I see you in Australia. So what I can say is that we have looked at a number of examples in other African countries, and no one has got the perfect solution. So everybody is wrestling with this. And the different countries have tried very different approaches when it comes to social security retirement reform. what I do find interesting is that when looking at what lessons we can learn in South Africa from other African countries, when it comes to the tier 1 non-contributory grants or social security pensions, we are much better developed, much further expanded. We've had them in place in South Africa for decades longer than the rest of Africa. So the rest of Africa, in terms of fiscal ability to put these out there into the communities, are very much constrained compared to that. The other countries have been basing the social security benefits on contributory formal sector schemes for a lot longer than we have, like I say. So they've had it's in place for a number of years already. What I find interesting is that you don't see a lot of the cross-subsidy effects coming through when we're looking at these, when we're doing these investigations. So although they've got them in place, they're also wrestling with the reforms. And in some of our neighboring countries, they like I say, they're on their second or third iteration of reforms, because they're also going through changes and realizing, oh, okay, we've got to tweak it a bit more, and we've got to tweak it a bit more. There's this perfect pensions paradise that nobody's yet been able to achieve, and no one's been able to reach it yet. So some of us, we're taking different paths, but none of us are there yet. So it's continuously, it needs to be seen as a work in progress, that there's always going to be room for improvement. Mrs. Carswell, your thoughts?
So something to consider is that one of the reforms that was proposed was to create a Department of Social Security and bring all aspects of social security under that. Like, to give people an indication of how fragmented it is, the UIF, which is our unemployment insurance fund, the benefits are determined by the Department of Labour and the contributions by National Treasury, so two completely different government departments. Hopefully there is some coordination between them in terms of setting those numbers, but we're not entirely certain about that. So there was a proposal to bring them all under the auspices of one department, but obviously that's a very difficult discussion for people to give up vested interests within government.
So what I always find interesting is that we have an existing national social security fund in South Africa. So but it's not got a retirement focus. So when we have this debate about introducing a national social security fund for retirement, then my view is, but why don't we just take what we've got and expand it? No, Stephen, you're nuts. That's not politically acceptable, because it's under one government department, and it's the different government department that wants to oversee social security retirement benefits as opposed to unemployment benefits. So that's why, like Megan is saying, there's a lot of change that needs to happen also within government in terms of how social security is being run overall, in our humble view.
Thank you. Yes, and so I think that would be my thought as well, is that there aren't perfect examples out there. And in South Africa, the challenge is exacerbated by the fact that not everyone in government isn't one voice. There are different departments that are driving for different things, and the available revenue is so small. So it's really a bit of a dog-eat-dog type of situation in terms of government spending.
Which brings me to the point that I was trying to make earlier. In South Africa, we don't have a lot of open jobs. So even if someone wants to enter the labour force, it's very difficult for them to do so. And we also have a mismatch between the skills that our unemployed people have and the skills that are actually needed in the marketplace. We have a lot of people who barely make it through matric, which is our high school level. So if you start talking about the fourth industrial revolution, you are completely excluding the majority of our population. It is difficult.
Thank you all. We'll throw to David for a last question.
Thank you, and thank you for your reference to the index. We look forward to seeing preservation, excuse me, take off in South Africa. But my question, and I really thank you and congratulations for wanting to involve the actuarial profession in the broader debate. That's and I think humility is a really good point in that, and a multidisciplinary perspective. I guess my question is, within the South African government, is there a government actuary role, and are actuaries already within government, or is that something you could propose?
I can speak to that point if you need me to.
Happy for you to jump in there.
Okay. So a few years ago, government created a body called the Government Technical Advisory Committee, or GTAC. which was meant to be a central repository of experts, basically to be called upon by government. And the difficulty actually came in terms of how much GTAC was able to pay. And as a result, there is a single actuary on GTAC who specializes in health. There is no official appointed government actuary. And so to a degree, this committee from the Actuarial Society fulfills that role in terms of doing pro bono work on social security reform.
100%. So that was your thoughts as well, is that there is unfortunately not a lot of budget for advice. So if you want to contribute, you do so on a voluntary basis.
Thank you to the team, and thanks for staying up late. Let's give them a big round of applause.